Order, order, and welcome to the Scottish Affairs Committee, and not just the Scottish Affairs Committee, but the Scottish Affairs Committee in beautiful Orkney, the second time we've visited in 5 years. And welcome to the Scottish Affairs Committee, and not just the Scottish Affairs Committee, but the Scottish Affairs Committee in beautiful Orkney, the second time we've visited. We're going to just pause for a minute till we fix this delay out. Is that okay? You're coming to you from St Magnus Centre in Kirkwall in Orkney. We are here today as part of our inquiry into renewables in Scotland, looking at the marine renewable resource that's here, and we're very grateful to the hospitality we've received and the very friendly and warm welcome. We have two special guests to start the session off today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and we'll start with you, Mr. Kermode.
Good afternoon, everybody. Neil Kermode. I'm the Managing Director of EMEC, the European Marine Energy Centre, based in Stromness, and glad to host you up on the Fall of Warness test site today. So thank you very much indeed for coming.
And thank you. And Mr. Milne?
Thank you. My name is Chris Milne. I'm the CFO of Orbital Marine Power, one of leading tidal developers in Scotland. You've seen our turbine today, which was recently deployed on the EMEC site.
Yes, and we did. We just come right off the boat after examining and having a look at this wonderful facility, and we're grateful to you for allowing us that opportunity. Can I just start? The Scottish Affairs Committee were here 5 years ago, and I think you, Mr. Kermode, gave us evidence at that session. Since we've been here last, do you think we've made that development, that progress in realising the ambition of this island and what this has in terms of a resource? And what more do we need to do to ensure that we've got everything required and in place to deliver this vast potential that Orkney has when it comes to marine renewables? We'll start with you, Mr. Kermode.
Have we achieved our potential? No, not yet. I think we've made some progress towards it. We've seen the deployment of several machines since you were here last, and most notably the Orbital O2 machines, the last one that's gone in so far. We've also seen the Magallanes, the Spanish tidal turbine go in, but they together represent 3.5 megawatts of capacity, and we believe there are probably a couple of thousand megawatts of capacity around these islands. So I think we've barely scratched the surface. But what we have been doing is a lot of work on that's fundamental demonstration aspect, so research development and then deployment and demonstration. And we've been doing quite a lot of that work by seeing these machines go in the water. So a lot of lessons have been learnt, but no, we haven't got our full potential. What more could we do? I think it's more of the same to a large extent, in that we need to get machines in the water. We have a series of mission statements as a company, but the short one is get metal wet. You know, it's get out there, learn stuff, come back, have another go, and get out there again. So that's what we really need to do. And we've got some specific suggestions about what that could look like.
We'll come into that. Is that really the message, get metal wet, that we need to deploy in order to ensure that this wonderful resource here is harvested properly?
Indeed it is, and there's many analogous industries that we can point to, which I'm sure we'll touch on through the rest of this session, which shows strong evidence that the real economic and socio-economic benefits that can be derived from that are here for us to grab, but that potential remains untapped at this point.
Is there anything in particular when you're looking at the strategies deployed by UK and Scottish Government that you're recognising and that will be facilitating and helpful, and things that you may look at and think we could do more and all that?
Well, of course, you know, the one key thing which is required to really be a catalyst for this industry is vision and early stage market support. Now, the industry is seeking, within the next auction round 4 for the contracts for difference, the industry is seeking 100 megawatts to be ring-fenced at a price of £250 per megawatt hour. It's also, in line with that, looking for the UK government to show global leadership in this, the year of COP26, and actually set out a vision for 1 gigawatt of marine capacity to be built out and constructed during the 2030s. This is the type of initiative which will drive home the UK's potential and make us realise the investment to date in this space. We all know that early stage activity, early stage entrenchment of supply chains means that these positions, these companies that take these positions in the supply chain are very hard to displace. The barriers to entry become far greater then. We have the opportunity to take that now.
Yeah. I want to come into supply chain in a minute. I just want, while we're here, and we've obviously seen a little bit of it today, and maybe just explain to people who are watching these proceedings this afternoon, what has Orkney got specifically in particular that makes this such a special place when it comes to marine renewables specifically?
So Orkney is geographically perfectly placed. We're at the intersection of the North Sea and the North Atlantic, which means that the tides on either are out of phase, and so we have very strong tides that run through these islands and around the islands. Those strong tides give us the opportunity to harvest energy from them by putting in what amounts to similar to underwater wind turbines. It's taking the flow, energy out of the flow of the water as it goes past. Orkney's also fortunate that we're the most northerly point on the national grid, so the energy we harvest flows into the national grid and does real work, but we are then slightly cursed by the fact that the national grid is inadequate for getting the enormous amounts of energy that we believe we can harvest out of the tides away from the islands. So it's been useful as a demonstration point, but if we're now going to move into the more industrial rollout, we will need better infrastructure behind us. We're also well placed, and we've got things like, say, Scapa Flow as a large body of water which allows us to assemble the shipping flotilla that is needed to go and do this sort of work. And we're also lucky we have got a good supply chain that's readily adopted things. So we have a very active, that's not what I'm looking for, lively mindset, no, that's not a word, nimble mindset that allows people to really get onto these initiatives and these opportunities when they come up. So we've got people willing to do it, we know we've got the resource, and we're now seeing that we have the energy need, and we're now definitely seeing we've got the planetary imperative. So all these things are coming together.
And just, you've both mentioned supply chain, so I just want to come this as my last question to both of you. And like in the offshore wind sector deal agreed in 2019 committed the industry to 60% lifetime UK content by 2030. Are we starting to meet that? Is there difficulties in the supply chain? Could you maybe just explain to us your observation of where we are in all this, and are these potentials being delivered, these targets being met? And we'll start with you, Mr. Milne.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to say Orbital's O2, which is the world's most powerful tidal turbine, we managed to complete that on budget despite the headwind of a global pandemic, and we completed it with around an 80% UK supply chain. Now that could actually be increased. The facilities, the infrastructure and the skills already exist here in the UK, albeit some of them have maybe been underinvested in recent years. But the infrastructure, the skill base, it's all here. So we generated what we calculated, and this was done with Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, up to 90 full-time equivalent years with the single O2 build. It was also the first vessel that was launched from Dundee, the Dundee docks, in 40 years. And that was without significant investment in the infrastructure to allow that to happen. The capabilities and the potential is absolutely here. It's in Orkney, it's on the coastal regions around all parts of Scotland, it's around the UK. Our supply chain spanned not just the local community, but all of the UK, from composite blade manufacture down on the south coast, to fabrication work from Wales to the north of England to Scotland. The steel itself was procured from Motherwell. So the supply chain evidence is there. We can do this. We can build this. The important thing is that we entrench these supply chains. We send the signal which allows them to invest in these facilities. As I said, that some of these facilities have been underinvested in recent years. This can be reversed. This can be a resurgence for a lot of facilities that are already there, and this can be a new business line which has significant export as well as domestic potential.
Is that you, Mr. Cobbold? I know we missed out when it came to wind turbines, perhaps, but are we in play to ensure the supply chain is going to be fulfilled this time?
I think Chris is absolutely right. We have the opportunity to do this. I think what we need to do is to choose to do it now. We need to make a commitment. The nation needs to make a commitment to want to do this. We did see that the UK failed to make the most of wind. And the comparison with Denmark is particularly telling. Denmark and the UK both had very similar scale wind programs back in the 80s. Denmark committed and stayed with it, and they sought to find ways to encourage a supply chain and encourage machines to be deployed. The UK, on the other hand, focused very much on the least cost of deployment process, trying to make as efficient as possible from day one. The result of that is the Danes have a very healthy wind industry and we don't. In terms of scale, Danish wind industry in 2016 had exports of 7.3 billion euros. The UK had 0.3. In terms of the scale, 7.3 billion, the UK arms industry in 2016 was 7.2 billion. So the wind industry in Denmark was as valuable to them as it was as the entire armaments industry is to the UK, and they've got a tenth of our population. My point is that if we commit to this early enough, we can make this work. If we blow it, then we only have ourselves to blame.
Great. I'm grateful to that. That's all from me just now, and I'll pass it over to Mary back. Mary.
Thank you. If I could turn to the funding that is available to you, in particular the Contracts for Difference funding, could you tell me the ways in which that is helping your organisation, and also whether there are any conditions applied to that funding?
Unfortunately, right now, the CFD process and under certainly the structure of auction round 3, it's not helping our industry. In fact, it offers no opportunity for the industry at all at this because of its structure. Again, you know, what the marine industry is calling for here is that, and you know, we have seen movements towards this, although the marine sector was strangely silent in terms of the energy white paper. But what we're asking for as an industry is that within auction round 4, there's 100 megawatts of ring-fenced capacity, as there has been in back in previous rounds. I think it was 2016, 2017 that this was removed, this support. We are asking for 100 megawatts to be ring-fenced at £250 per megawatt hour. Plus, as I said, the vision for a gigawatt to be installed through the 2030s. That's the type of vision that will catalyse investment in the sector. Now, the CFD themselves, we believe that we can be competitive at those prices, and we could believe that we've delivered blueprints that will help us deliver much lower costs in very, very quick timescales. This means that the cost to the consumer through the CFD, we've done some research ourselves, and we estimate that it will be a fraction, less than 10% in this opening round, for instance, potentially only 7 or 5% of the cost of facilitating offshore wind. But the important point is, the point I made earlier, the actual return on that investment, because of the heavily UK-based supply chain, will be multiples.
Right.
The CFD has been effective at driving down cost, and that's worked well for mature technologies. I am concerned if we just focus purely on the CFD, then we run the same risk that I mentioned earlier that Denmark ran. So I think Chris is absolutely right. We need the flag planting in the hill, which is a clear policy signal that the UK wants to do marine energy, and the AR4 ring-fenced area would be exactly that flag in the hill. And then AR5 and AR6 beyond, there'll be other things to go for. But without that flag in the hill, nobody knows where they're going. So I think that's important as one. The second part is, to get to that, we've seen machines like Orbital who are able to get there, but we also know there are other developers around who've got machines which are not as advanced as Chris's company's machine. And so we believe there's also a need for support for innovation in that interim step. So it's not just having the flag on the hill, you need a road to get to it. And so we're calling for something called the IPPA, the Innovation Power Purchase Agreement, or something similar, which provides the sort of support that we saw people have through the renewables obligation. And we've seen that those prices work because we've seen kits turn up. We've seen people do stuff. We've seen people succeed and develop their technologies. But it absolutely requires that support to be in place. Without it, we will lose industries. We are also already seeing a couple of companies, Sustainable Marine Energies and Nova, have both stated their next plans are likely to be in Canada rather than the UK because of the lack of signal in the UK at the moment. And the key words are at the moment.
And what impact does that have on, I suppose, the long-term certainty of projects? Is that...
Well, nobody is going to... if you're a big investor, you've got a choice where you put your money. If you don't see that government believes that this is something it's going to do, you're going to put your money in something that is showing more signs. So we've got the offshore wind sector deal. We're seeing a clear commitment. We're going to go and do this thing. Yeah. Brilliant. And so we're seeing people scale up. People will not scale up for marine if they're not sure it's going to happen. So without that sign, I am very concerned that we will simply see this industry slip through our fingers. We've already seen companies leave the UK. We will see everybody else go in due course. Yeah. It will be a travesty because we know we've got the resources here.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we heard last night was that there is a problem in terms of the conditions attached to some of the funding at times. And sorry if I'm wrong, but a lot of the times the funding has to be spent within 3 years, is it? Does that have a long-term effect? Because that's a quick amount of time to spend a lot of money.
There are a number of conditions which are in there which are pretty unhelpful. So things like the contract for difference, it requires you to have a number of conditions in place, and you've got a planning permission and things. So it is extremely difficult. There are an awful lot of tripwires there. And I keep asking myself, if you were trying to make this happen, would you make it as hard as you could or as easy as you could? Yeah. And I think there's a fundamental question we need to ask, which is, how can we make this happen, not how can we drive down the cost to the barest minimum? Because if you drive it to the barest minimum will happen. Yeah. And we need to be quite generous. I think in my evidence I referred to it as quite parsimonious support, and I would absolutely stand by that. It's pretty meagre. And if we want this to work, you need to fund it sufficiently so activity happens. We're only talking about a few machines at the R&D space. If suddenly we ended up putting thousands of machines, A, I'd be amazed, but B, it would indicate we were overpaying it. But I really don't think we are. We need to make sure we've got sufficient support to go and do the complicated thing that these guys have been doing and do it safely and sufficiently and with all the innovation benefits that derive.
So do you think that these tripwires, so to speak, could be easily removed? Or do you think there's still a necessity for them?
The way we always look at it is something in line with the laws of physics and chemistry? Because trying to change those laws is really hard. Trying to make gravity work in a different direction, don't bother. But the rest of it are laws of man. They're things that we've written. They are strictures and structures that we've put in place, and people have written those regulations. If you don't want them, you can change them. So I think there are opportunities to think in an imaginative way to make the most of the opportunity that we can see exists at our feet at the moment. And I think we're duty-bound to do so. And
just finally, we've seen the staged approach to developing the small and large-scale sea trials. So, I suppose, do you think that such a structured approach is helpful, or do you think that should be looked at?
I'm not an engineer, so there's. But I think again, it goes back to the learning by doing. Orbital Marine itself has started. I think we've had 16 different scale models. So you have a concept, you test it at small scale, you see what things could be improved, you see what things go wrong, you improve it, you make it slightly bigger. But what that's all doing is driving it towards a commercial product. So I completely agree with the point Neil was making earlier. Everything's here. It's the tripwires. Tripwires can be circumnavigated. Tripwires can be resolved when you get to them. We have all of the resource, natural and human. We have all of the facilities, all of the required infrastructure. What we don't have just now is the market. Create that initial market, and we'll be able to resolve all of these other minor complexities. And what that will do, it will mean that we, as the UK, will drive the costs down, which unlocks those resource regions elsewhere in the world, makes it attractive to political policies elsewhere in the world, and creates that export market for us.
So what would you say is the most urgent, what do you call it? The most urgent blockage to us accessing that market?
It's the reform required under the contracts for difference.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to both witnesses for your time today. So just to follow on there from Mary's couple of points, I understand from our visit this morning that Orbital was partly crowdfunded. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, of course. I mean, part of the reason that we chose to go down the crowdfunding route, actually no, there was two. There is undoubtedly appetite in the investor community to fund tidal projects.
Okay.
I spend most of my job is going around, selling the vision and speaking to funders of projects, funders of companies, about what we're trying to do and how we're doing it. And unanimously, they like it. But what they can't do and what they don't like is the fact that before this we're only building one, or we're maybe going to build two. They're not interested in that. They want to be building 10, they want to be building 100, they want to be building 1,000. So they are waiting in the wings to invest.
That proof of concept, yeah.
Well, we've got the proof of concept. What's missing is the market. So we've de-risked our technology. Our SR2000 device generated over 3 gigawatts to the Orkney grid, breaking a number of records, and the O2 will deliver even more. It's going to be a 15-year project. So the technology is there ready for commercial deployment. What's not there is the market to support it. These investors were willing. We went through due diligence with some investors who were willing to take that early stage exposure on a single project, but the costs were high, because the risk of that being money in one pot and nothing ever coming out the back of it was also deemed to be high by those investors. So the first reason that we used crowdfunding was because we were able to sort of diversify some of that risk by bringing more people in. So one person wasn't delivering a multi-million-pound cheque. We were able to spread that risk across numerous smaller investors. Now, the important second point is that these investors were supporters. So, and this is why we chose to use crowdfunding. We are aware of the, and we're very welcoming of the debate and the renewed interest in tidal energy and marine energy within Westminster, and the Scottish Government has continually been supportive over the last decade plus. But we knew that one of the things that we could do as a company and as a sector was raise the awareness even further. Make the political influence and the political pressure much greater, so that the government knew that the general public actually wants this to happen. Yeah. If you asked somebody on the street why we can't harness the tide when we've been able to harness the sun and the wind, they'll probably be quite confused, because you wouldn't have thought it was that difficult. And you know what? It's not. We've done it. Yeah. But we can't deploy the technology yet. So the crowd was a way for us to get the message out, get public support behind the sector. And I think we've been very successful in doing that. We raised £7 million in 10 weeks, so average £100,000 a day. And we've got now over 5,000 investors from the general public across debt, project finance on the O2, and actual investors in the company itself. So a lot of support.
Yeah, absolutely. That public appetite you've been able to harness. Thank you. So we've talked about sort of tripwires and challenges. And one of the things we've already had in the 2 sessions that we've had is discussion around transmission charges. In what way have transmission charges affected the development of renewable energy? You mentioned that Orkney is on the national grid, but I understand maybe from our conversations last night that was about putting power to Orkney, and the challenge now is how do we get that power that Orkney can generate into the grid? Yeah,
that's correct. The Orkney was put onto the grid, and some of the islands, like the ones we went to today, only went on the grid in the mid-80s. So the cables that were put in were designed to supply power to a community of 20,000 people. They weren't designed for a community here to supply a country of 60 million people with electricity. So the cables were put in, they were fit for purpose at the time they were put in. However, at that time, the principal model for generating electricity was dig coal up, burn it near the pit head, and send the electricity somewhere. So it was a system that was centralised power generation and distributing the power. And so the charges that were set for the movement of electricity, effectively, the further it goes, the more you pay. Yeah. Now, of course, we're in a different position where we know that our energy is largely going to come from the periphery of the nation. Yeah. We know it's going to come from a
variety of different places as well.
Absolutely right. And so we think that the whole transmission charging process is now out of date and needs to be refreshed. And we particularly think that a lot of the costs that are going to be needed that are strategic costs should be socialised in many ways. So, for example, the infrastructure that's put in to bury cables and things in central London is a socialised cost, whereas the cost for us to bury a cable across the Pentland Firth would come down as a developer cost. And we don't think that's really appropriate anymore if we're trying to reshape our entire electricity network. Trying to bolt something extra on the edge, that's one thing. If you're trying to reshape it, it's a different set of rules. So we don't think the transmission charging processes really work for the new world. They probably work for the incumbent generators, but they don't really work for the new world.
Absolutely. And is that a view you would share?
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, we are targeting net zero. Some of the best renewable resource sits in the north of Scotland, be that marine or offshore wind. So why would we make that more expensive to develop? Surely we need to develop the most energetic resource if we're to hit our targets. Why would you put an impediment in place and try and handicap that with small-term economic benefit? It doesn't fit, as Neil says, it doesn't fit the aims and the targets that we're setting ourselves as a nation.
Absolutely. Now, we had the Chair and Andrew Bowie and I spoke to Orkney News outside before the session today, and they talked about the levels of fuel poverty in Orkney. So what way do you think we have an opportunity for just transition by reforming the transmission charges? And also would be interested if either of you heard Ofgem's evidence to our previous session, what your thoughts were on that. Come to Mr Milne first.
Well, I thought there was a couple of contradictions, to be honest. You know, there was talk about having to reform the way we look at things in a more strategic way, and yet there was, at the same time, there was talk of it just, you know, there's no problem here. The system is fit for purpose. I don't agree with that. I believe that if we are to look at particularly offshore resource, be that wind and marine, you know, we need to reshape the strategy of Ofgem to meet the needs, the net zero needs. I mean, one point to make, I mean, I'm not saying that we should adopt this, but I mean, in Europe, the renewable energy projects don't have to bear any of these costs. So we're already at a bit of a disadvantage because actually our power has to bear these costs, and power that we could import through interconnectors doesn't. So, you know, that's something, you know, if that's the way it is, that's the way it is. But why would you then subsequently further handicap your most energetic renewable resources by actually giving them a disproportionate proportion of those costs? You know, it genuinely doesn't make logical sense, and it does need to be reviewed urgently.
Yeah, potentially creating a dependency on the UK being dependent on others when actually that's far from the case. Mr.
Well, it's interesting that a lot of the costs associated with some of the interconnectors that have been placed from the UK to mainland Europe, the way the costs are dealt with there are very different to the way the interconnector will work between Orkney and mainland the UK. We do think there is a need for a fundamental refresh on that. And indeed, it's been recognised that there's been a need for this for some time. I've got here a copy of a document which was issued well, basically, in the 1989 Electricity Act, there was an indication that the Secretary of State could issue guidance on matters of social and environmental importance. And that was issued eventually in 2010, so it took nearly 20 years to get the guidance out. But the guidance says a number of things, including the fact that about incentivising industry participants to have a decarbonised system, and enabling, a government expects to include the incentivisation where appropriate of essential strategic investments ahead of firm commitments by generators. Now, these are particularly things that I'm not seeing in Ofgem's judgments that have been taken into account. Interestingly, this document was in the process of being overhauled when the coalition fell, and it was being replaced by something called a strategy and policy statement. That apparently is being drafted at the moment in Whitehall, but we've certainly not seen a draft of it at the moment. And certainly it would be very useful to understand whether the rules, which these are basically Ofgem's rules on how they will deal with things other than their cost to consumer and security supply, whether those rules are going to be sufficient for the 21st century. And as Chris mentioned, they need to have net zero, and I would argue they need to have the industrial strategy woven right through them. Because if we have a regulator who's not actively playing with the team, one has to ask which way they are playing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So certainly was something for us to consider. Thank you, Chair.
And Sally-Ann.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to have a look at the targets for renewable energy. So it's very clear that both the UK and the Scottish governments have set not just targets for net zero, but also quite ambitious targets for renewable energy set by both governments. The Energy White Paper specifically states the need to shift from fossil fuels to clean energy, and our oceans, as is very clear from going out in the boat today with you, Mr. Commode, and to see Orbital O2, our oceans have almost an infinite ability to provide energy by having the right technology in there around the UK, which we can provide jobs, make money from. So my point is, with ocean energy, the potential for that is not just dependent on innovation, research, development and great ideas. It's dependent on policy, regulation and investment. You've touched on the regulation of Ofgem there, but how can those ambitious targets for renewable energy be set by the UK and Scottish governments? How are they going to be achieved? And you've touched on regulation. Are the policy incentives enough to help UK and Scotland meet those targets?
Right, there's quite a few questions in there. So let's have a go. How can the targets be set? The targets be set really by means of vision. And as Chris pointed out, I think there are some very clear short-term targets that could be set. A nebulous target of a huge amount out there in the future is one thing, but actually some very small-scale targets very close to would be really useful. So ring-fencing 100 megawatts in each of the AR rounds would be really useful. That shows a determination to make it work. It's an approachable and a number which can be achieved. So I think targets that are sufficiently granular that show that you're making progress towards them. Have we got the right policies in place? Not really, not at the moment. There are a number of things that we really want to see adjusted and tweaked. And it's too long to go into all of them now, but happy to supply some views on those later. But there are, we seem to have got all the pieces of policy. What we don't necessarily seem to have done is join them all up. But we still keep coming back to this point that I want to make about Ofgem. In Ofgem's evidence, they kept saying that they're all here about doing things about the lowest possible cost. That came through from Mr. Mahan's evidence several times. Lowest cost, lowest cost. The point is, if we seek to go for the lowest cost, we will fail to achieve the maximum market. What will end up with something cheap that barely works, as opposed to something which is excellent, works really well, and is therefore an exportable product, and something that people want to buy and want in their market. So I think we need to make sure that we recognise that as early movers on this, we need to do this in a way which is fulsome, thorough, competent, and all the rest of it. If we just simply drive to lowest cost, then we will end up with something that's cheap and probably nasty. So I genuinely think this lowest cost mantra needs to be challenged to make sure we recognise that there are values other than simply the price you pay on the electricity. There are the opportunity costs of not doing something. The opportunity cost of buying an industry back in from overseas because we let it go from here. We need to recognise those are costs which have to be factored into these decisions that are being taken now about how hard we should push marine energy. So I think that if we make sure we align all our policy objectives around driving an industry to happen, as opposed to driving the cost to the bare minimum as soon as possible, we will end up with a very different outcome.
So just briefly before I turn to you, Mr. Milne, talking about Ofgem, so looking at lower cost and looking at the security of energy supply, when we look into the future, would you agree that security of energy to supply is actually going to depend on diversity of that energy supply as well?
Without doubt. We absolutely know that what we're going to see, Ofgem is going to face a change in regulation because it's the Office of Gas and Electricity Markets. Gas is going to become decreasingly important because electricity has become increasingly important as we electrify transport, we electrify so many other things. So the electricity piece is going to come in. So Ofgem are going to face change anyway because the gas piece is going to become less important. And they're also probably going to end up becoming the regulator for heat, one would expect. So they're going to face change. I'd really like us to help them get with the programme as quickly as possible. And I speak as an ex-regulator. You know, I am not in any sense having a go. I'm not anti-regulation, but these people need to be made sure that they're brought on side and are driving to the objectives that the nation now has, which is net zero and our industrial renaissance.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Mr. Moore?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's within. I don't think there's any question about how important the electricity sector is to global ambitions around the climate crisis, and I say that for three reasons. You know, one, you know, it's currently a high emitter of carbon, but two, we actually think that we can see there's visible technologies and emerging technologies that can help reduce that, and three, those things are the linchpins for other reductions in other sectors. You know, whether that's producing, you know, forms of electrification across vehicles and other transportation in other sectors. You know, it's low-cost renewable energy that can help unlock all of this. Now, I don't think there's a problem with focusing on low cost, as long as we're driving it and it's over the right timelines. Right now, the low cost is being too short-sighted. You know, build a 10, 15 gigawatt transmission line up to the north of Scotland. I'm pretty sure that'll get filled with projects in fairly quick time. But when you don't build it, and people in project by project are having to try and justify that cost, you paralyse yourself. And that's kind of where we find ourselves. I'm simplifying this clearly, but that's kind of the position that we find ourselves in here. So we need to take a step back and recognise that we have the ability to facilitate this sector. I mean, at the end of the day, talking about marine tidal in general, you know, these are big fabricated structures, potentially big, some small. These are fabricated structures out in the middle, well, offshore. They're generating energy. It just happens to be electrons rather than hydrocarbons. Now, at the end of the day, the right tidal resource site, that's like the reservoir that never depletes. It's right there for us, and we're just not making it happen.
So it's absolutely possible to reach those renewable energy targets that have been set with the right modernisation of regulation, policy ideals. What additional incentives are needed to develop those sort of emerging technologies in Orkney? What else do we need?
The key thing, and I'm speaking here as you know, in the fortunate position of having a technology that we're ready to deploy commercially, but there will be other technologies. You know, we recognise as much as anybody else that the climate crisis is real. We need to deploy all solutions. No, we're not a silver bullet orbital. Tidal itself as a whole sector is not a silver bullet, but we need to deploy all potential solutions. So, you know, continuation of R&D funding. The clear thing for us, once again, 100 megawatts to be ring-fenced at £250 per megawatt strike price. You know, this is like a gauntlet. We need to deliver, otherwise we don't access it. We need to deliver it and make money for investors, otherwise we won't get another chance. So, you know, this is the way. Let the market do what the market does. Set the parameters and allow technologies to compete for investors' capital and deliver cost reductions, which delivers to the consumers, to the global population, low carbon, predictable energy. We can do that. But that needs to be across the board. So a mix of the R&D funding for early stage, but we've never lacked that necessarily in recent years. But who wants to provide R&D funding for something that's never going to go anywhere? And with R&D funding, you need to find match funding. Who's going to provide match funding where actually you don't know how you're going to ever generate a return in the future? Okay. The market needs to be there.
Okay, we're going to have
Mr. Commode, just can you come in on that? Have we got time?
Very quickly.
Sorry, Chair.
I think a carbon price would be really helpful. We understand the value of carbon, or more accurately, we need to associate a cost with continuing to fly tip in the atmosphere. So that has to come in somehow. And from Orkney's point of view, we think recognition of what we're doing, a mandate to do more, and the flexibility over some regulation would actually make a huge difference.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Andrew Berry.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Milton, Mr. Commode, for coming this afternoon. I'm going to ask about jobs. I'm going to ask about jobs first. There we go, we're on. I'm going to ask about jobs, but before I do, I'm going to go back to a comment that you made about the supply chain and the fact that it was a 80% UK-based supply chain. Was that a conscious choice of yours to go down that route, or was that something that was forced upon you? Or did you have other options that were cheaper and yet you decided to?
There's always other options. But no, we're very proud to be, the company originates from Orkney.
Yeah.
We're Scottish engineers, Scottish-based engineering, and we're a UK company. Yeah. So we were very much wanting to make sure that we were flying the flag on all counts. As I said, there's always options, but the reality was we had the facilities, we had the skills, we had the infrastructure. So, we could have chosen to do it elsewhere and then suffered, import costs and transportation costs. But why? Again, the skills and the facilities were here, and we were proud to use them. What we are actually doing right now is we're doing exercises, and we're working on a project to see how ready our supply chain is to scale up, to build 5 machines, then 10 machines, 50 machines. Yeah. So we are actually working with the UK supply chain to make sure that they're ready and they know what they're going to do and how they're going to invest in their own facilities should we see the visibility of this market.
All of that is, of course, dependent on having the skill set there and a number of people trained and able to deliver for the demand that you predict you're going to have in the next few years. Obviously, representing Aberdeenshire, I've seen the amount of jobs that have been lost, the amount of people that have moved away as a result of the oil downturn in 2014 and the lack of equally skilled jobs to replace the ones that disappeared as a result of the downturn. Is enough being done to train those people in the new technologies? Are we attracting people from, for example, the oil and gas sector? Are we attracting enough people from the oil and gas sector into this renewable sector? And what more can be done to train the next generation in the skills that they will need so that we can have a burgeoning, lively, successful and profitable renewable sector in this country?
I would like to think that we're just at a hiatus at the moment.
Right.
The reality is that we're dealing with offshore fabricated structures.
Yeah.
Fabrication yards exist. The people to work in those fabrication yards are still here. We are dealing with umbilicals and all sorts of other offshore engineering, which is very familiar to both shipbuilding and the oil and gas sector. The oil and gas sector, I think it would take minimal retraining for huge amounts of those affected employees to be able to retrain and be very positive, productive members of the growth of this emerging industry. As I said before, at the end of the day, some of the only differences is that it's electrons rather than hydrocarbons. It's going down those umbilicals and cables. Yeah. So, the skill set is there. Minimal retraining, I believe, would be required. I can't speak for wind, but there's a huge amount of analogy for marine and tidal in particular. And, yes, we will. That skill set could easily transfer.
The estimates that we've seen show that around about 4,000 jobs could be in the marine energy industry within this decade. And we reckon that rises to about 22,000 by 2040. Yeah. So we think there is meaningful and useful employment. What we've seen at the moment is we haven't seen a skill shortage. Okay. What we have seen is that people are keen to find ways to get involved in marine energy. Yeah. And from MEMEC's point of view, we've increased our staff by 17 people, even during the pandemic. So we've taken people on. The main challenge we do have is principally around electrical engineers. Right. And so the continued push towards STEM subjects and things like that, critically important.
Well, I was going to ask, you already, Mr. Commode, spoke about how MEMEC is the NASA of renewable energy, which is an incredible description.
What wasn't my quote? It was one of my colleagues who joined us, actually came from Chile to join us. But
right,
yes,
very good. And that just shows that you can attract people to the sector. On STEM research, what are you doing with universities and schools? Because back when I was in school in the dark ages, when the oil and gas industry used to come in and encourage kids to join BP, join Shell, join Total, have a great career in hydrocarbons, are you doing the same sort of thing, or is it a cross-industry or cross-sector move to get into the schools and encourage people to, get into STEM subjects and get into this growing sector?
I wish there were, but Orbital. How many people are in, Chris? How many people?
32 at the moment.
32 people.
Yeah.
We're not BP, you know.
No.
So you know,
Yeah.
So the thing is, we don't really have the firepower to do that.
Yeah.
We know we need to.
Yeah.
So a certain amount of information is shared with universities, but not enough.
Yeah.
We know there's a lot more that can be done in that space.
Okay.
There's a huge amount that will be done. If we're talking about putting in the thousands and thousands of machines, they will all require people. By definition, a lot of these things will happen in coastal areas,
Yeah.
and the best place to service them is the coast near the area where the tide is. So
Yeah.
these are going to be very localised activities. So even if the machines are built elsewhere, possibly, you know, and brought in and deployed, that's one model. But frankly, we could build them here.
Yeah.
Chris's
And we
team has shown we can build them here. We could do this if we
Yeah.
want to, but we've
And-
got to show we want to.
And what we don't want to do, like wind, is have the expertise overseas and then be
Correct.
importing all the technologies just to be put in place here.
Exactly.
And what we've done with offshore wind is we have ended up with pretty much small-scale jobs.
Yeah.
The real high-value work, the vessel suppliers, the really complicated IP stuff, that's all sitting overseas. So we've paid a high price for walking away from wind back in the 80s.
Absolutely. Has either of the Greens Jobs Funds, by either UK or Scottish Government, have they been of help to either Orbital or EMIP?
Pass. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to speak to my finance director because I can't remember exactly where we have been getting help, but we have been grateful for the help that we have received. But we do see support through people like Highlands and Isles Enterprise and Scottish Enterprise. They route things through. So
We reviewed it intently, both in terms of the funding intensity and the quantum.
Yeah.
The reality was, and I'm coming back to the point, you know, jobs are mouths to feed. You know, jobs are permanent fixtures in your business, and we want more. We want to grow our business. We want to employ as many people as we can. But when we are working project to project, bringing on a full-time member of staff is actually quite challenging because you don't know if they're still going to be as busy and the requirements still going to be there in 2 years or 2.5 years. Now, what we looked at, and again, if the CFD was in place, I said 80% UK content. We've looked at and assessed the potential for doing more manufacturing in the UK, not less, more. Now, we would consider potentially even setting up or co-funding and being JVs around our own manufacturing facilities for certain components and parts of our turbine. That type of project, that would have been an eligible project to bring staff in and actually apply through that through the Green Jobs Fund. But because we are having to do everything more short term, because we don't have the visibility that the market creates, we were simply precluded from applying for it. You know, we were maybe eligible as a company, but we couldn't find a project that would fit because we don't have that visibility.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And thank you both. That was fascinating and interesting as always. And thank you for your time coming along this afternoon. And can we have our next guest, please?
do you want us to? Do we?
Okay.
Will.
Please. Great, right. Thank you both very much for your time this afternoon. Just for our record and for anybody who's watching our proceedings, who you are and who you represent. And we'll start with you, Mr. Davis.
My name is Gareth Davis. I'm Managing Director of Aquaterra, a local company, and I'm also on the board of OREF, the Orkney Renewable Energy Forum.
Thank you. And Mr. Bruce.
Yes, I'm Stephen Bruce, and I am the project officer for the Refit project from Orkney Islands Council, and I'm also part of the energy team who manage the energy and emissions output of Orkney Islands Council's properties.
Excellent, thank you for that. Well, in this part of the session, we want to look at interconnectivity, access to the grid, and some of the issues around transmission charges. And I'm pretty certain that you two have got quite a lot to tell us about these various issues and subjects. So, can I just start that? We now see that Ofgem have conditionally approved a need case for a new cable to connect Orkney to the Scottish mainland. Could you tell us what that process was like? Was it easy to access this and progress it, or what difficulties did you encounter? And we'll start with you in that one, please, Mr. Davis.
Yes, I think it was anything but easy. It's been a 2-decade odyssey, which isn't over yet. So Orkney recognised that to realise the ambition that you heard about from the 2 previous speakers, we needed a new grid connection as early as 2002. And we've been in a constant dialogue with Ofgem and Scottish and Southern Energy since then about how we can best deliver that. And that's involved a considerable amount of money invested in it, a considerable amount of time. And because it hasn't happened yet still, a lot of the challenges that have been faced, not only for the sectors that we've talked about for the marine energy industry, but also for onshore wind within the communities and for home-based generators. We have 1,000 households that are generators on the islands. So all of these groups, these cohorts have been disadvantaged by that. So the other challenge is that the needs case process is quite remote from communities and from the generators themselves. The responsibility for submitting the case lies with the network operator. And so the degree of collaboration and cooperation in preparing that case is at the best of the operator. Yeah, that hasn't gone particularly well this time. The case that was put forward had some quite big holes in it in terms of the generation needs on the islands. There is one good piece of news, is that the deadline that was set, the expectation for Ofgem was that we had to have 135 megawatts by Christmas of this year, and that's been put back a year. So we're very grateful for that, and that's probably the crumb of comfort that we get out of the process.
And Mr Bruce, I imagine that Orkney Island Council has been pretty much involved in this whole development, and I would imagine that it's quite a number of bits of resource have been put into this. Who's actually going to be paying for this new cable and substation if it's delivered?
The exact people who are going to pay, I'm not entirely sure, but the wind turbine project itself is funded by Orkney Islands Council. The community wind turbines, that's around about 86.4 megawatts, and that's part of the 135 megawatt confirmed required by Ofgem. But SSEN's own assessment was that 86.4 megawatts would be enough on its own to justify, and then the additional capacity would then be attractive to marine renewables developers.
I mean, Mr Davis referred to some of the micro projects that obviously we've seen in abundance on the islands and the contribution that makes. I mean, I will start with you first, Mr Bruce. Just could you give us a sort of flavour of the difference it would make to this emerging economy and this dynamic activity in the island if we did manage to secure this grid connection?
Certainly. If that grid connection was made and we could develop all these technologies at a large scale within the islands, the hope is that we would be able to create a large number of jobs. And recently the council received a report that they'd commissioned on the benefit to Orkney and then to Scotland as a whole. So we would hope to see around £807 million worth of economic benefit to...
How much? Say that again?
£807 million worth of economic benefit to Orkney, and then in total 1.5 billion for Scotland.
Is these figures that you recognise, Mr Davis? And maybe you could give us a little bit of a flavour about the difference this could make to the island?
No, absolutely. It kind of goes back to the evidence you just heard in the previous session, that at the moment we have a system of evaluation of cost, which is purely based on customer cost down the wire, as it were. But what we don't take account of is the other benefits that come from that. So the employment benefits, the revenue benefits, the supply chain benefits, because all of this technology, a wire, a substation, that creates business opportunities as well. But the amounts of money involved in upgrading the infrastructure are significant.
Could you give us an idea of what that would be?
So the cable connection across the Firth is costed around £200 million for the transmission cable connection. Now that's up to a certain level, let's say 150 or so megawatts. You could put in a slightly bigger cable for a relatively smaller sum. So if you put in an extra, say, 50 megawatts, that might come at a 10%, 20% extra cost. Then you can start to put on the tidal generation, the wave generation. So that integrated way of thinking about system development is what we've been crying out for, one of the things. And the other piece is that within the islands, we have a situation where our distribution grid, the smaller scale wires that connect our communities, they're not able to cope with the reverse generation that we spoke about. So if people are setting up their houses to generate energy and feed it back into the grid, that's filling these distribution wires. And so we also need to think about linking the distribution network and the transmission network in a one process, but at the moment they're split into separate processes.
I'm sort of presuming this isn't something which is unique to Orkney as an island community, and this is something that's experienced by the range of islands across Scotland, because I think, again, we're all assuming that you've all got the same type of resource, even though Orkney may be a little bit more abundant in certain parts of them. But is this the case that most of the island communities are finding this difficulty with grid connection?
Yeah, I mean, in our own case, Orkney obviously has a small grid connection already to the mainland. Shetland doesn't have a grid connection, but hopes to get one through a similar process. But they've been waiting 10 years now for their grid connection. The Western Isles, like Orkney, have a small grid connection, but are very keen to get an expanded grid connection. And this infrastructure allows the communities to participate and provide the resources that Neil and Chris have spoken about. But the other thing is that as energy customers, we pay every month for a proportion of that investment. You know, £150 of a normal bill goes into the investment in socialised infrastructure. So every bill that Orcadians pay is paying for infrastructure that's put somewhere. And you would expect that maybe on a cycle of fairness, eventually that infrastructure would come to us. But at the moment, we've just been feeding in for 50 years, and we've never been able to get the opportunity for that infrastructure to be provided here.
Lastly, from me, I mean, I hope if we come back in 5 years' time, you'll have got your connection. But what happens next now? And is there any timescales that's in plan for making sure this is delivered? And maybe you could help us with that one, Mr. Bruce.
I'm not entirely sure on the final timescale for delivery of the cable. That would be something that will be in the planning process with the...
And is that a matter for Orkney Council then, in terms of the planning arrangements?
Well, planning for the community wind turbines, that's been forwarded to the Scottish Government for a decision, just because of the conflict of interest. It was felt that was the best way. We would certainly be pushing to have that all ready by the deadline, but beyond that, it's sort of out of our hands. We can push, but we're sort of bound by regulation and process.
Will it be here by the time we come back, Mr.
Say it again, Peter?
Will it be here if we come back in the next few years?
I'm absolutely sure that the Orcadians will have found a way of dealing with whatever situation is thrown at us, which is what we've done today. I think it actually links back to the CFD argument as well, because at the moment the onshore wind regime has also suffered. We've talked quite a lot about wave and tidal, but onshore wind has also been constrained by the previous CFD philosophy. So that needs to be in place. So to pay for the grid, people need to win CFDs to have the option of accessing the market. So that theme of market access is really key. The system at the moment doesn't suit the kind of generators we have here.
Okay, thank you for that. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks to you both for your time today. I suspect I know the answer to this because it's a similar question I asked to the previous panel, but do you believe that transmission charges have affected the development of renewable energy in Orkney? And I suspect the answer is yes and negatively, but please say no.
Yeah, I mean, basically there's a number of issues with transmission charges. So everybody understands that somebody somewhere needs to pay for transmission, and that's perfectly fair and understandable. A number of decades ago, the UK set up a locational scheme which had bands that go up the country, and as you go further away from the southeast, it becomes more expensive to access the grid. So that means that, for example, in Orkney, the estimates, and I'll come back to that point, but the estimates are that we might have to pay £100 per kilowatt hour to access the grid, whereas if you're in Caithness, it would be around £25 per kilowatt. And as you get further south, it drops. And if you're actually in Cornwall, you'll get paid £10 per kilowatt to access the grid. So that's one of the things that we have to deal with. But the other problem is that the predictability of that cost is just not known. It's been a matter of debate, and the ranges have gone from £150 down to £50 in Orkney. So we've got a kind of less than 50% and more than 50% variability. So to go to the investment proposition, if you're going to investors and saying your access to market could vary from here to here, it's an incredibly difficult economic proposition to make. So those are the two biggest hurdles.
It's a barrier in terms of cost, but then that lack of certainty around cost as well presents an additional barrier. Now, my understanding is Ofgem have said that people closer to electricity being generated pay less for that electricity, and what we've heard obviously today and over our visit is what Orkney is doing in renewables. And is that actually the case then, or Ofgem correct, Mr Bruce?
Well, in Orkney, we do suffer because of that. So we do have higher energy prices just because of the system we're kind of burdened with. And it does seem bizarre that we're a net exporter of electricity, and yet we have amongst the highest levels of fuel poverty and higher electricity prices because of that. It's frustrating, I think, to say.
And has that been one of the barriers, or how has that shaped the community wind turbine conversation? Because in some ways you can see it's right there being generated, but you're paying more. Has that made it more difficult?
I don't know if it's made it more difficult. Certainly, we're, as a council, we want to invest in renewables just for the good of the planet and the county. We would like to see an economic benefit, that money from the generation coming back into the council, and then that could be reinvested in the county through better infrastructure, the ability to provide better services for the Arcadians. So that's kind of our background behind it. But I think it certainly makes it a lot harder to justify with the increased costs for that export.
Okay. And Dr Davis, you clearly obviously think there's a number of challenges, but what do you think Ofgem need to look at? What would improve the situation, or if you had a blank piece of paper in relation to transmission charges, what might it look like?
I think it's basically a new system. There's not much of the current system that meets this new world order, if you like. So that involves radical change. And often people are resistant to radical change, but I think, if we're facing a climate emergency, it's probably not surprising that our regulatory system and the charging regime does need to change, particularly because where energy comes from now is very different to where it is came from in the past. And in the future, it's going to change again. So the way that we value, going back to the point Neil made, the way in which we value energy needs to be different. It's not just how much we pay in our bills. It's about the jobs, the investment and the wealth that comes to the country. It's about the carbon content. It's about the secondary costs that come from continuing to burn oil and gas as opposed to renewables. It's about the export opportunities. At the moment, this country needs to think very carefully about how it presents itself to the world. And if we want to be part of that export community, selling clean technology over the next 3 or 4 decades, we have to be leading that. And it's really important that we make the right moves there. And at the moment, we're getting held back by the regulatory and charging regimes that we have.
It's actually preventing you from creating the market, Mr Milne suggests.
Absolutely. It's all linked up, and we need all of those building blocks to be in place. And what we end up doing is papering over the cracks in one area to kind of allow things to progress. But that means that we're not functioning at full potential at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. And we now go over to Andrew. Andrew Berry.
Making sure the microphone's on this time. Thank you very much, Ms Davis and Mr Bruce. The net zero targets are described by many of us in Westminster and in Holyrood as being ambitious and world-leading, and in many respects they are. Do you agree, and do you think that when various pieces of legislation are passed or announcements are made in either parliament, it 9 times out of 10 falls on the local authority to deliver the changes required so that we meet our targets nationally. Are we ambitious enough, and are you getting the support you need as a local authority to actually deliver what you need to so that the UK meets its net zero targets?
Yes. In terms of the targets themselves, I think, in Orkney, we are lucky in that they should be relatively achievable. There are certain factors that are going to be quite difficult to overcome. There's quite a reliance on oil heating with no connection to the mains grass grid, which is a bit of an issue. So electrification of heating is going to be the main target for a lot of our works. Certainly in our commercial properties, we've been doing so for a few years now, but moving towards heat pumps and electrifying those, alongside making the buildings as efficient as possible. We've had the support of non-domestic RHI for that in many cases. Unfortunately, that's ending, or it's ended now for non-domestic, so that that makes the business case for the additional capital cost that little bit harder to make. We're really keen on kind of decarbonising across the board, but if we've only got a limited budget for these works, and that only goes so far when you've got multiple schools and office buildings to maintain, to retrofit, to take out the oil heating or electrify the heating in there, as well as improve the fabric of the building through insulation upgrades. And then certainly on new builds, again, there's an additional capital cost. We tend to go for ground source. We do live in the maritime environment, and we found that air source can be that little bit more susceptible to corrosion, whereas if you have your ground source, you've got the boreholes under the ground, protected, and then your plant that's actually generating the heat is inside and protected. So that again is a more efficient technology, but it does come at a higher price. So it's, I don't know if Gareth has anything else.
Yeah, I think your targets are, as Ken was said before, are really important because they drive ambition. And I don't think you can be too ambitious about climate change because the imperative is so great. The fact that maybe we didn't quite get there, to me that's still a success because it was an ambitious target. So you're better to set ambition and just come under it rather than play safe. I think one thing that might be useful in relation to targets is also working at a regional level. And this is something Orkney, if you like, has used as experience over the last 20 or 30 years to help other countries in their developments. And that approach of regional development targets is something that we advocate in other places. And the reason for that is that different parts of the country have very different contributions to make. Okay. So if you think of Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles, where we've got the tremendous resources that you've seen today in abundance, the role that we're going to make to decarbonising the UK is going to be huge. And it's going to be very different from, say, central Perthshire or, central Glasgow or whatever. Now, that doesn't mean we're better or worse. It just means that the contribution that we've got to make needs to be totally different to other places. And the national targets don't reflect that regional focus. And I think that allows different realities to start to build up in people's minds. So that's something that could be really helpful, is developing regional targets that reflected the contributions that different places can make to that overall target.
So, Mr. Davis, if you had one ask of the UK government that we would take away from here, would that be it?
It's in regard to the targets, it's one thing that could make a difference. And it actually links to the market and all of the other things that people have talked about, because if you start to say, well, Orkney's going to have X amount of tide, X amount of wind to contribute to the UK system, everything else has to fall into place to support that. Okay.
And Mr. Bruce, if you had one ask of the UK government on this issue, not on anything else, what would it be?
I think I'd probably agree with Gareth. It'd be just something that's a bit more appropriate to local conditions. Not just a blanket. You have to reach this target.
And that's the impression you have right now, that the UK government is just a blanket
target net zero 2050, and it's a race to see who gets there first.
There's certainly an impression of that. That's my view. Others may have different.
That's all right. So thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Sally Hart.
Thank you, Chair. Is it working? Sorry. Just wanted to ask a bit about local community and their behaviour and the requirement and behaviour change towards climate change and renewable energy. So obviously we are going to have to make changes, and we've got to take people with us. So if people start thinking that everything's going to cost more, etc., there might be a reluctance from the general population to come along on the journey for hitting net zero. So in terms of Orkney, it's quite advanced in its production of renewable energy. And has there been opposition to this, Mr. Bruce, in this area, in Orkney? Have the population been along with that? Have they opposed it? Can you tell me something about that?
Yeah, largely it's been very well received. Obviously there's a minority that are against it. It's not really in terms of the technology or the need to decarbonise. It's more along the lines of there's too many wind turbines. It's spoiling the landscape and their views. But I think in principle the vast majority are in favour. In terms of the potential increased costs, we've tried to show that through the Reflex project, which Gareth is also part of, that that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. There are ways of decarbonising in a cost-effective manner, and if we've got the support, we can help people come along on the journey to decarbonise, to electrify their heating, transport, all those things that they use. I think that's generally it's just been accepted that we will get there, but there's I think difference of opinion on how. I think this might be the main but sort of minority.
I think you indicated to Wendy Chamberlain when she asked you a question that the cost of energy isn't cheaper on Orkney with the renewable energy. So how has the changing the systems been funded? Have you buffered the costs for local people if it's them who've had to pay more? How has the funding been given? Where's it come from?
Best person to give you detail on that might be Gareth. He's all over that particular topic.
Yeah, I mean,
Dr. Davis.
Yeah, the price that we pay for our energy is a UK-based price, so we have no freedom to intervene in that process, and that's one of the problems with the current system. It was set up to protect the centralised generators, and there's a technical term called peer-to-peer trading, which has been experimented with, but we haven't really been able to adopt that. So the high prices that come from fuel poverty are basically driven by the fact that in previous times, the system imposed a 2p surcharge on people in the north of Scotland and the islands because of the difficulty in getting energy to them. Now, when that became politically uncomfortable, a measure was put in place to kind of cross-subsidise to take that out of the system. But as well as that, what's happened is that people's houses tend to be in exposed locations. They wick heat away. The amount of energy that you need to actually heat these homes is high. And we don't have the option of gas as a heating alternative. So, in most other parts of the country, you can go to gas and get a cheaper heating solution. We haven't got that here. So we're trapped in this electricity and oil bubble in terms of our heating costs, which is a main part of it. So that's been a key driver.
So would you say that there's been a just distribution of the financial burden?
Not at all. I think that the challenge that we have with energy policy is, and I was just looking at the white paper again at some of the numbers, it's all about average household. And we run our country on the basis of average numbers. And of course, up here, we're not average. There's some things we're fantastic with, but there's other things where we really get penalised. So, you know, a typical household bill in average UK might be £1,200. It's probably £300 or £400 more than that up here. We use energy for mobility, for the ferries, for the aircraft. The amount that people in Orkney pay for transport is much, much higher than other parts of the UK because of the cost it takes to get off the island. So we always say that Orcadians understand energy much more because they pay more for it than any other part of the country.
So looking at localism and the whole aspect of localism and passing power back to local communities, that's what we really need to do, don't we?
Yeah, I think we'd all raise a cheer at that. It's
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. And Mary Black.
Thank you. Is that on? Yes. I would like to ask you a bit about, Andrew asked the previous panel about this, but when it comes to the...
All right, okay, you got that.
Yeah, when it comes to new workers coming in, is the bulk of it people being retrained from a specific sector, or is it people who are brand new to the job market, or is there a healthy mix of the two?
I think there's quite a mixture. What's interesting about Orkney as a jobs market is that we've had virtually total employment for 20 years. So if there's a new job created, it's either going to pull somebody from an existing job or you're going to pull somebody new in. So if you look at our population, it was just below 20,000 in 1999. It's gone up to 22,250 now. So we've increased by 10% over that period. Now that bucks the trend that some of the other islands have experienced. And a lot of that's new workers coming in to support the renewable sector. And you can actually go down the list of who works in the sector and say, well, they came in for that job, they came in for that job. So it's a very tangible issue. And I think going back to the point that you raised about training, one of the other features of renewables is that it has been pioneering here. So we're not necessarily looking for new people to come into the sector and be trained up by people to do a job. What we really need is experts that are really innovative and groundbreaking in their field to come together to create something that hasn't existed before. So we're still at that early stage of development. So attracting talent is our biggest thing. And then what has happened, and maybe Stephen can talk to this, is that there's been then an influx of opportunities for younger people to come and get involved in the sector.
Yeah, certainly, I suppose my own experience was kind of the wrong time, really, in that, you know, I went away and did my first undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering and came back, did a master's at the ICIT campus in Stromness, and it just happened to be that, you know, there was a bit of a downturn in renewables at that point, but since then, certainly there's been more of my peers have, you know, become part of the industry. They're not necessarily spending all their time on it, but they certainly have gathered experience and, you know, have been trained in renewable technologies or work in the sector. I think from the council's point of view, long term, we would like to see a pipeline of school leavers joining the sector, either through apprenticeship or, you know, further education, higher education. There is the risk at the moment that, you know, people will go away, start a career somewhere else, and then they won't come back. What we need in the long term was that those people do come back, and they are the experts that Gareth is looking for.
Yeah. So do you think, would it be fair to say that there's almost like a chicken-egg situation in that you're wanting to attract those people with the experience and innovation, but how can you attract them if you're not getting concrete projects off the ground?
Absolutely.
Is that essentially what the main problem is?
So this links back to Chris's point about the market. If you have the market, then it can pull other things there. What we've used is, because we haven't had the market and we've had to adapt, we've actually made innovation a substitute market, and that gives you a certain level of capacity, but you're employing 10 people rather than 100. Right. And that's where we've done really well. So we've invented capacity and we've innovated to support that innovation marketplace. But what we want to do now is scale it up. And part of it's because we want the jobs, but it's also because we've got the energy there and we know the country needs it.
Well, just lastly then, do you think that enough people are being trained in renewables, or in the renewable sector, certainly to meet what our targets are?
If there's a need for training, and this may sound a bit circuitous, but it's absolutely true, it's the organisations that are controlling energy is where we need training.
Right.
It's not young people, as Chris I think said, we've got all the skills, we've got all the capacity we need. We just need the space for that capacity to be made productive use of, and that involves organisational change and development, I'm afraid.
Excellent. Thank you.
Can I just ask, obviously what you've got here is fantastic, and we really enjoyed our time here looking at what's available and the opportunities that there is for people on the island. We know this is leading and cutting edge internationally. Who are the competitors internationally who are looking at this? And what do we have to do to ensure that we remain predominant and don't give way to somebody who might be coming in here to try and take over?
You okay for?
Yes.
Yeah. We're lucky in our business, and part of this adaptability is that we've internationalized in the last 10 years. So we're working in 20 different countries at the moment. So there's a long list of places that are interested in Orcadian expertise and Scottish and UK expertise. And something that we've come to realize is that it's not actually it's not competition in the sense of winners and losers, because the need is so great that what we just have to do is scale up to make our contribution, and that will be more than enough success for everything that we could want. But the problem at the moment is that we're not necessarily seeing that joined up strategy to allow us to make that contribution. And so, like the US, obviously with Joe Biden coming on board, is making a huge investment in renewable energy. Their investment levels in marine energy alone are going to billions of pounds a year. At the other end of the world, if you like, in Southeast Asia, places like Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, these countries, they have a paucity of energy, themselves, so they're looking to their resources and are very fleet of foot. So if the UK can make a huge contribution in these places, but we have to make sure we keep our position at the table, if you like. So I think it's better for us to think about how we can maintain our capacity to make a contribution rather than actually being seen as somehow winning that game, because that puts us in conflict with other people, whereas what we need to do is work with them.
Interesting. I mean, the countries that we've heard probably most about is Chile, China, Canada. Is that the other nations that are in this game, Mr. Bruce? And what's your view about collaboration versus competition and what we need to do in order to keep this position that we have internationally?
Oh, I think we're in quite a lucky position in Scotland in that we do have all this resource and expertise, and we need to make sure that we maintain that and that it is exportable, and that's from a local level to national level and then international level as well. Certainly there will be later on competitors, I suppose, but we do have that advantage in that we've got the early adoption, but we do need to scale it up to make it something valuable, something exportable, so that we don't then fall into the situation that was mentioned previously in the wind industry with Denmark. As to the countries with the large resource, they'll be looking to develop ahead of us. They might look to maybe take some of the expertise we have, if they can afford it. But we need to make sure that we have it, it's exportable, but that essentially it's retained within the UK to benefit us as a country.
Mary?
Thanks. Forgive me if this sounds a daft question, right? But in layman terms, if Orkney was able to realise its full potential in resources, what could that power, like in terms of the actual energy it's producing, just to kind of give a context to it?
Yeah, so we did this calculation when our Prime Minister came to visit last summer, and And basically, if you look at the productivity of the wind, the waves, the tide, the area around Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles can deliver 50% of the UK's total energy needs. So not just electricity. This is replacing oil and gas and other forms of energy. So it's half of our total energy demand can come from this part of the world.
So if it's as simple, see if it's as obvious as that, why do you think nothing's, why are we not there yet? Is it politics, essentially?
I think it's taken us a little while to realise what's on our doorstep. But I think if you're into the middle of average households here and small changes there, sometimes that big picture gets missed. Yeah. And we were saying last night, the recognition of a climate emergency forces you to think differently. They say the status quo is not an option. Mm-hmm. And I guess that when you're close to that resource, it allows you to have that vision more easily. But certainly, all of you coming here today and yesterday is a big help, because that helps spread the message and help show more people, what the potential is and how we can meet that need that is desperately required at the moment.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, on that very positive note, thank you both very much, and all the other guests today. I mean, this has been a fantastic and fascinating trip for us once again, and this goes to the previous panel too. Anything else that you could usefully help us with this inquiry, please pass it on. But I mean, I'm certain, looking around, the colleagues here will be keen to include what we found here as part of our report and our conclusions and recommendations. But for today, thanks for your time and attendance. Order, order. Great, thanks guys. Great, really, really good.